and welcome to Crime in Court. My name is Heather, and this is the 1996 Menendez Brothers Trial, California versus Erik and Lyle Menendez, and we are going to go over part two of the defense's opening statement, and this is for Erik. So you may recall in the first trial, we had two separate juries. In this trial, we have one jury, but we still do have two separate attorneys. So a set of attorneys for Erik and a set of attorneys for Lyle. So each one will get to do cross-examination if they want to, and each one gets to do an opening and closing statement. So um, let's get started. We're going to pick up right where we left off. Oh, first, I almost forgot. Before I forget again, the because of the LA wildfires, you may have already guessed that the resentencing hearing that was scheduled for January 30th and 31st has now been moved to March 20th and 21st. So that's a Thursday and a Friday in March, and it's quite a ways away, which is very unfortunate that they have to wait now 2 more months. Um, but you know what? It's just they just can't catch a break. It's it's like everything's against them, unfortunately. But let's hope everyone's okay. On another note, Brian Friedman, who is the attorney for the Menendez family, the 20 plus family members that are all very much they're in favor of the brothers being released. Brian Friedman is that attorney for those 20 plus, I think it's 24 to be exact. But don't quote me on that. So his house, unfortunately, Brian Friedman, the attorney's house, unfortunately, is gone. He lost it in the fire. So keep him in your thoughts also, as well as, when thinking about people, the victims of the LA fires right now. All right, so let's get started. Please hit the like button and let's pick up right where we left off. Oh, and by the way, look in the description below if you would like to go to the PDF document and follow along. I have placed transcripts and some information on there for you for like there's a spreadsheet as well that's going to give you all of the different people that will be testifying and whatnot. So I'll give you that link too. So check the description for that. All right. So we're going to continue on with where we left off from the first episode. Basically, he told her she had about 15 minutes left. And since this is the beginning of part two, you can pretty much tell that she goes a little bit longer than 15 minutes. But she's I don't want to say lengthy in her approach. One thing I want to say is usually, if there is a time limit on your opening statement, which usually there isn't or shouldn't be, but sometimes they might put a time limit on your opening statement, then in that case, that should have been determined prior and not in the middle of her doing her opening statement and then the judge saying you have 15 minutes left. So that part is kind of unclear. I don't know if she had a time limit or not, but regardless, if it takes 3 hours to get through everything you think that's coming in, then maybe, give them some grace. Maybe, pare it down as much as you can, but if that's what it is, that's what it is. And I mean, she is trying to defend someone's rights, his ability to ever live on the outside of prison walls again relies solely on Ms. Abramson. So, I think if she wants to take 3 hours for her opening, she can. Excuse me, that's just my opinion. All right, let's get started. So Ms. Abramson says, okay, after he says, "You'll speak more concisely." She says, "Okay." One of the other things that happened over the course of his childhood, remember, we're talking about Eric, over the course of his childhood with respect to his mother, that would raise the suspicion in Eric Menendez's mind that his mother either knew or suspected that what was going on between him and his father is that she had this ritual she would engage in, which was called checking you out. And what she would do is she would examine his genitals. She did this until he was 15 years old. And she would break blisters on his penis that she would find, but she never asked him how he got them. Now, he was not sexually active at 15, except this molestation that was going on with his father. The main activity of Ms. Menendez's life, as it will be testified to, was to make sure that her children were totally involved in these competitive sports and their involvement in competitive sports of competitive sports of all sorts from the time they were preschoolers left them with no time to make friends. This is part of their pattern of isolation that you will hear about. You had no time to play. They had no time to read. They really had very little time to do homework. As you know, the parents did a lot of their homework for them. They had no time to explore. They would be ferried from one sport practice to another or one sports competition to another, and their mother made sure she was the one because Mr. Menendez, remember, was working in the city and he's commuting a lot. She's the one who's there day in and day out to enforce the very regimented boot camp like life, as Eric will describe it. So he's describing life at home like he's living in a boot camp. But she complained about her children at the same time. She resented all the planning and the running around and all the ferrying about that she had to do. And she told her children, for whatever all of her built up frustrations and angers and unhappiness, she told them and she told relatives that she hated her sons and she wished they were never born. So, if this is what I say to people who are like, but they shot Mrs. Menendez in the face. Well, you don't know the truth then about Mrs. Menendez. And I didn't either going into the trial. I didn't know that she was so much of a willing participant of the maltreatment. At first, I was like, well, maybe she's just really maltreated herself, and that's what causes her to be the way she is. Nope. I mean, maybe in part, but for the most part, I think she was very much a willing participant in a lot of the things that she did, especially like you have the option to not say, I hate my sons and wish they were never born, but instead she said it to her sons' faces many times throughout their lives growing up and also to family members, relatives. Oh, 1 minute. I forgot to put the heading up. Hold on. Okay, there. Now the heading's up. So if anybody stops by later and doesn't realize what they're watching. All right. So let's move on. So she also told that to people that she also and she told that to people before they even left New Jersey. Okay, so this was before they went to California, she was saying these things. So we know it was many years now that she was telling her children that she wished they were never born. Something a mother probably shouldn't say to their kids. Just saying. Probably does some damage to them psychologically. All right, so now those same relatives will tell you that secret. They understood that secrecy was being forced in this family because Ms. Menendez herself was extremely secretive and private. As I've indicated to you, she told her children not to portray a true picture of what was going on with their schoolwork or their athletics to other members of the family. She concealed forever that Erik had learning disabilities. She even concealed it from Erik. So she didn't even tell the person with the learning disabilities that they had learning disabilities because that was too much of a tarnish on their reputation. So she didn't tell him. Something that could have been he could have worked on, he could have gotten help for, and he could have gotten, tools to work through that disability. Instead, she let him suffer and think that he probably he thought that he wasn't smart because he had a learning disability and it was not his fault. It was his mother's fault for not giving him the adequate tools he needed. She even concealed it from him, and she therefore denied him any chance to get any kind of remedial education. So she just let him suffer with with his learning disabilities. In the private school he went to in Princeton, they saw that he had these learning disabilities, so they enrolled him in a special after school class to help him with these things, and his mother, who of course was in charge of his schedule, made sure that he never ever attended that class. What was also seen by everybody who came in contact with this family was how extremely competitive Mrs. Menendez was, and how both she and her husband had this theory of making their children competitive. And one of their ways was to expose the children to frightening situations to toughen them and ignore any complaints that they may have or fear. You may remember from the first trial, they would hide and jump out and scare them. There was an instance where the brothers were home alone and the parents pretended to be strangers trying to get in and knock on the door and laughing hysterically at the fear that they were instilling in their own children. Who does that? Sadistic MFers like them. So, apart from all of that, the people that were closest to her will tell you that she rarely, if ever, displayed any affection towards her children at all. To Erik, the greatest moment in his day, he will tell you, is the day on which his mother smiled at him. And there were a few, particularly if he won something. She was equally competitive with Erik, needing to bring down high grades in school. I mean, she knew he had learning disabilities. There was very little time to do homework. Nevertheless, both parents demanded grades because through grades you could get in. They were in a very prestigious public school. They could get into a private school, grammar, and from that you could get into the next prestigious school. And from that, you could get into the next prestigious school, and prestige seemed to be all that mattered because, as Erik will tell you, it never mattered to his mother if he learned anything so long as he had the grade. As a consequence, she did a lot of the school work for him. She cheated for him, and she encouraged him to cheat. Even Erik came into possession of stolen tests from the school. His father made out the tests for him. So the messages that they were getting was perform, perform, win, win, and if you don't, you're worth nothing to us. And cheat your way to the top if you need to, because who cares? Success is more important, apparently. So now, what happened to in Kalamazoo that week in August before the family returned to Beverly Hills was that Erik lost the big round in tennis. So this is like leading up to the homicides, I believe. He had played very hard that summer. He had won earlier on in the competition, but that week he lost, and his father was enraged with him to an extent that he had never seen. And what he perceived during from that time on, from the loss in Kalamazoo all the way up to through the week of crisis, was that his father thought that he, Erik Menendez, had no value to him, and this whole history of his family was one of the reasons that he was one of the reasons that he was convinced that his parents would take their lives, take his life especially, because he was worthless to them at that point. That's how his father treated him for having lost the competition in Kalamazoo. Now I told you that the evidence will show that there's only two people that Erik Menendez ever told about the molestation. One was his cousin, and the other was his brother. So Andy Cano is the first. Andy Cano was Eric's closest friend, confidant, and first cousin. And we know Andy Cano is no longer with us. I believe it's 22-year anniversary of his death was on the 18th, I want to say. It was just a couple days ago. I posted on my X page about him. Um, he had an accidental overdose of sleeping pills or something. Yeah, it was something like benign, but it was like an accidental overdose or something like that, and kind of a freak way to go. But he did struggle with issues, substance abuse earlier on in life. But I believe he was, working through that. Anyways, rest in peace, Andy Cano. All right, so he told Andy does testify again in this trial, so we'll probably read through his again. All right, so, oh, hold on one sec. All right, moving on. And he didn't tell his brother until the week before the homicide. So Andy knew earlier on, but I think they were still, probably like 15, 16, maybe a little younger than that when he finally like asked his cousin if it was normal, if his dad was doing the same thing to him. And then Erik didn't tell Lyle until this week leading up to the crimes, basically. So he didn't tell him until the week before. But his relationship with his brother was something that was extremely important to him that week. As I've told you, what you will hear in this case is how Mr. Menendez tried to keep these boys as rivals, as competitors to each other. But finally, by the time that Erik was an earlier teenager, it was clear to him that there was one person in that family who really did care about him, and that was his brother Lyle, because Lyle started to defend Erik in subtle ways, in the ways that you could defend against a very strong and menacing set of parents against Mr. Menendez's threats of physical and psychological attacks that he engaged in all the time with Erik. But Lyle would try to intervene. He would try to keep Erik calm if he was being yelled at or screamed at by his father. Lyle would go to his parents sometimes and make Erik's case for him. And so this in a kid who was otherwise extremely isolated made Erik admire enormously his brother and made him feel tremendous gratitude towards him. To this day they are very, very close. They share a bond that no one can ever understand. So, you will hear evidence that Lyle was perceived in that family as the stronger and the smarter and the more talented, and the father spent infinitely more good attention on Lyle than he ever did on Erik. What the effects of attention from that person may have been on Lyle is for proof in his case rather than ours. But the fact of the matter is that here is the younger brother, the dumber brother, as the way Erik saw it, the weaker brother, the less well regarded brother, the brother about whom the father, had never had any real expectations being helped, being loved by the smarter, better looking, stronger, older brother. It was a bond that was irresistible, as the experts will explain to a kid as deprived of affection as Erik was. So he definitely looked up to his brother, and it's a very strong bond that uh, has formed between the two. So there was one person he trusted and one person he loved, and that was his, apart from his parents, who never got it back. There was one person he loved who gave it back, and that was Lyle. Because the judge wants me to finish, I'm going to skip some of the history here, if you'll bear with me. When the family moved to California in 1986, only three of them came. Lyle remained behind in Princeton. He was going to go to school. He needed to pull his grades up a little bit in junior college, and then he was going to be admitted to Princeton University, so he stayed behind. So Eric came out here with his father and his mother, and he had this magical thought when he was back in New Jersey. He will tell you that by leaving New Jersey, maybe the molestation would stop. Maybe some of the worst abuses in his family would stop. Maybe maybe things would get better. This was his short-term rescue fantasy, of course, if you will, because he was at that time 15 and still 3 years away from college. So there was no hope of getting out anytime soon. So that's a long term rescue fantasy. But they got out here, and what he began to hear inside the first, they rented a little apartment and they rented that house in Calabasas, and something was very, very wrong with his mother. And what he heard was that his mother had discovered that his father had been having an affair for 6 years, and she was definitely devastated by this completely. She cried day and night. She spent months literally in her room crying. Now, here is Erik Menendez. He's 15 years old. He's in a new state. He doesn't know anybody. He's in a new school. He doesn't know anybody. He's an insecure and anxious person to begin with. And his mother, in spite of all the negative things about her, she still is an anchor in his life. She's still the only other person and only female person he's had a long term relationship with. She's important to him and she disappears on him, but she leaves him. She leaves him to find self deletion letters where she's threatening to take her own life. His feeling of abandonment at that time was so extreme that he called his brother Lyle back in New Jersey hysterical that his mother was going to take her own life. This is 1986, and Lyle therefore comes and tries to help her, takes her side. Mom, come with us, live with us, leave him, live with us, we'll take care of you. And she attacks Lyle. She turns on him. She blames him for her problems, which is a recurrent theme throughout their whole lives. As Dr. Wilson will explain to you how this added sense of isolation and abandonment by his mother that begins in 1986 increases Eric's problems, the problems that culminate in the shootings in 1989. Another thing that happened in those first 6 months in California, for reasons Eric did not immediately understand, his father did not molest him the whole first 6 months, the 6 months when his mother was most upset. They were having arguments every night. She's crying during the day, but they're having arguments every night about about this affair business. And during that same 6 month period, when his mother is openly hostile towards his father and arguing, there's no molestation going on. But after the 6 months, much to his shock, the molestation resumed. And at that point, he tried to run away. He packed his things, and it was his mother who intercepted him, and she told him that he would never get away from them, that he had nowhere to go, that he could never support himself, never make it on his own, that he needed to get through life. He needed them to get through life. So a bunch of gaslighting, manipulation, whatever you want to call it, trying to tell Eric that, he's helpless and worthless without them. So when his father heard about this was a particularly ugly episode of SA in which his father threatened him with a knife that had been provided by, above all people, Carol Co. It was a souvenir Rambo knife that was kept in the family. And you will see it here in the courtroom, this gigantic thing that this man held at his son's throat and threatened him and told him that he could never leave. We never saw the knife in the first trial, so that's interesting. She brought it in for this one. It's obvious to Eric that he understood why there was that violent a threat because whenever he went, the secret that could ruin his parents went with him. So wherever he went, that secret that could ruin his parents went with him. So they wanted to keep close tabs on him. By the spring of 1989, Erik, as you know, as I've indicated, the evidence will show he was accepted at UCLA. And he was, at that point, totally focused on getting through the summer competitions, playing tennis well enough and hard enough to make the UCLA tennis team, which is what his father insisted he had to do, which is what he wanted to do. For all the pressure that tennis gave him, it also gave him something good. He was good at it, and people admired him for it, and he had a sense of accomplishment. It was the only thing in his life that he had a sense of accomplishment about. So he was very focused on doing well in tennis that summer and then going off to UCLA in September. What happened, though, is that he did not. He had already been accepted at UCLA, and he'd also been accepted at UC Berkeley. So he was slacking off on his studies that last summer, as most high school seniors, you will hear from one of the high school teachers, tended to do because there was no reason to get good grades to get into college, and what he did need to do was spend all of his time working on his tennis. And so, this coach that Mr. Kahns, the prosecutor, referred to in his statement that Erik wound up hiring was already hired by the family to be his tennis coach, and he would work with this tennis coach every day. So he was already hired by the family, not by Erik specifically. So she's refuting what Mr. Khan said in his opening, because that's what he had said, that Erik put the inheritance money towards the tennis coach. Well, it looks like they had already hired him. Maybe it was owed to him, maybe he was already under contract or something. I don't know. And he would work with this tennis coach every single day and play matches with other players every single day to get his game set up. As a result, his chemistry was failing, and his father was so angry over that. And that is what triggered what I've referred to before as the last act of sodomy. Because by the time Eric Menendez was a teenager, the sex with his father didn't seem to really be just for sexual gratification. It was a way to dominate him, a way to control him. It was a power thing on his father's part, and sex had become a punishment. Whenever his father thought he was rebellious or defiant, it was punishment. Well, there were only two things that his father ever openly accused of him ever being rebellious or defiant about. One was failing chemistry, that was rebelliousness in his father's book, and the other was that he refused to recite at the dinner table every night, and the father had demanded for his entire life his total practice schedule. What shots did he work on in tennis? They both talked about that, where they had to like go over their entire like game play by play with their father. If he didn't get to see it, they would have to do it later when they got home or over the phone. So it's weird that he would make him recite everything. So he had total control over his practice schedule, what shots he did in tennis, what part of his game was improving, at what time precisely did he practice with this person, at what time precisely did he practice with that person. And this is the kind of drilling and going through these practices move by move that his father demanded and got from both of his sons their entire lives. At 18, Eric had a need to feel some like a grown up, and so he had the nerve to refuse to recite these details to his father. His father knew that he was taking lessons. He's paying for them. He knew exactly what he was practicing. Most of it's going on in his own backyard. They had their own tennis court in their backyard in Beverly Hills. Someone's home to see them doing it. But Eric wouldn't tell him. He thought he was becoming rebellious, and that is what led Jose to tell his brother in law, Carlos Baralt, that he was going to disown Eric for that rebellion. But what in fact he told Carlos Baralt, when in fact Carlos Baralt will say, was told him is not the version you heard from Mr. Khan. Carlos Baralt will say that by June of 1989, Jose Menendez had told him that he was going to write a new will but he told him that he had already told his sons that he had written a new will. So he said he was going to do it, like he hadn't done it yet, but he told his sons that he already had, if that makes sense. I mean, it makes sense. So he told Carlos that he had told his sons they were already disinherited, period. And Carlos Baralt asked him why he would do such a cruel thing, and all he answered him was he talked about problems that Lyle was having, never gave his reason for being angry with Erik, never said anything as ridiculous as he won't tell me his tennis schedule to his brother in law as a justification for disinheriting a kid. But that's all there was that he had against Erik in the spring of 1989, that he didn't go over his tennis play by play with him. I've already indicated to you that over the course of that summer, Erik will tell you that he played really hard and he played really well until the very end in Kalamazoo, where he missed a game. He didn't miss a game, he lost a game that his father expected him to win, and his mother was enraged, and his father canceled a trip that the family then was supposed to take to Canada, where Mrs. Menendez's father was ill with cancer. And so Mr. Menendez, because Erik lost, punished everybody, wouldn't let Mrs. Menendez go to Canada. None of them went there to see her father. So she was then angry at Erik for depriving her of the trip to Canada. Oh my God, there's so much projection going on in this household by the mother. And when they got home, there were a series of meetings between Erik Menendez and his father. And at one of those meetings, his father sat there with him and told him they were talking about registration at UCLA. And his father told him that when he went to register for classes, if he couldn't get in the class, that his father already chose for him. And he wrote out, you will take this, and you will major in that, and that, and that. And then after college, you're going to business school. And then after that, you're going to law school. He just played out his entire life for him. And he said to him, if these classes that I have picked are not open, you have to call me from registration, and I will tell you which other ones to enroll in. Well, that was not so unusual that it upset Erik Menendez, but the next thing his father said was that he didn't have faith that Erik would be able to get himself through college. Therefore, Erik could not live at the dorms full time. To me, that just sounds like an excuse because he wants him back to keep that control over him and to have him there at his whim if he wanted him. So, as he had been promised, he was going to have to come home and spend at least 3 nights a week sleeping at home. And the excuse that Mr. Menendez gave to Erik Menendez was that this was so that they could monitor his schoolwork. But for Erik, this meant something very, very different. You could sort of hear the sound of the re- rescue fantasy crashing, because to him, this meant he was never going to escape from the sex, which was the worst or the most hated part of his life. And he didn't have any idea following that conversation how he was going to survive, because this was his fantasy. UCLA rescue. I can move on in my life, and now that fantasy was gone. So he was ready to embrace living away, not having to deal with his father, and we know his father was going to still be very, very much part of his life and still perpetrating the maltreatment. And his immediate reaction was to go to his room and pack some clothes because he thought, maybe I'll go stay with a friend so I can think and cope. What am I going to do with this? But his mother came into the room. This is on a Sunday, and in fact, at this point, I may as well unveil this thing. I don't expect you to read all of that. Now that is only for very good eyes, and that doesn't include mine. I don't know what you're talking about. Some exhibit maybe. But what that is a chart that shows the critical events of the crisis that unfolded between Sunday, August 13th, 1989, and the Sunday, August 20th, 1989. And I can tell you what happened on those days, and what's up there is just an outline of those things. So she didn't do this in the first trial. So I think this is an interesting approach that because this week leading up to the crimes is so important, I think it's really good that she's trying to lay that out for them. I wish we had the visual because that would be helpful, but unfortunately we don't. That Sunday, April 13th, Erik had packed. He was thinking of leaving the house for a few days when his mother came into the room and she was very angry with him. She told him he wasn't going to go anywhere. His father heard her screaming and he came into the room and asked Erik what did he think he was doing. He pushed him up against a wall. He told him he could never get away. He had nothing to complain about, and that Erik had better still be there when he, Mr. Menendez, returned from a business trip that he was supposed to take the next day. In fact, he didn't leave the next day. He didn't leave until Tuesday, but originally he was scheduled to leave on the 14th. Nothing I have n- nothing I nothing I have nothing down for Monday, August 14th, because nothing with respect to this case occurred on that day. But on Tuesday, August 15th, 1989, that's the day that Mr. Menendez actually did leave. He left town and he was due to come back Thursday at 6. In this afternoon on Tuesday, August 15th, Erik saw an argument that had Erik saw an argument that was going on between his mother and his brother, and this was happening in the entryway of the house. And in the course of this argument, see, when the parents, Erik will explain that when his parents come back from Kalamazoo, his mother was angry and upset at him. His father was angry and upset with Lyle. It was as if his parents had declared war on the children. As this was like another skirmish, and he didn't understand what was going on or why. What he sees here is an argument between his mother and Lyle, and in the middle of the argument, his mother reaches over and starts to like pull on Lyle's hair, and the hair comes off. And at first, Erik thinks, oh my God, she's torn his scalp, and later he realizes that what he did was she removed Lyle's hairpiece. So his own brother didn't know that he wore a hairpiece. So now Erik will tell you, because Erik will testify. Lyle does not in this trial, FYI. Um, and that really has to do a lot with him trying to get people to lie for him on the stand, which, in hindsight, probably shouldn't have done. So now Erik will tell you that in this family full of secrets, although he knew that his brother had started to have thinning hair when he was only 16 years old, and although Erik, no matter how much apart they had been with Lyle at school in Princeton and Erik living in California, Erik had noticed that Lyle's hair looked thicker, but he thought he had done implants. In fact, he didn't really know what he did. What never occurred to him was that he actually had a removable hairpiece. Unfortunately, it wasn't meant to be removed the way Mrs. Menendez removed it, and it hurt, and Lyle started to cry, and that's something Erik had never seen, not since they were little kids. So Lyle ran away. I mean, he lived at the guest house on the property at Elm Drive. There was the big house, there was a swimming pool, there was a tennis court, and there was a guest house. And Lyle runs off towards the guest house, and Erik, who's been in misery ever since Sunday, when his father tells him he's going to have to come back home, sees Lyle, and now Lyle looks like someone who's unhappy too. He didn't ever really think. He hadn't gotten out of his own head enough to wonder how his brother's life was at that point. So, out of a sense of empathy for Lyle and a desire to commiserate, he goes back to the guest room and he starts talking to his brother in the course of it. And in the course of it, he breaks down. He's very depressed. He starts to cry, and he tells his brother that what's been going on between himself and his father. Now, when Erik was younger, there was a time that his father came to him and beat him up really beat him up. And his father accused him at that time, when he was about 10, of having told Lyle what was going on between the father and Erik. And Erik had not told Lyle when he was 10, but Lyle asked Erik sometime after this beating and when he was 10, if things were still going on between him, meaning Erik and Dad. And Erik told Lyle, no, everything's fine. Never asked him, Lyle, how do you know? No, everything's fine. Well, now fast forward 8 years later, and Erik tells Lyle that when he had told him at 10 that things had stopped between him and Dad, that was only because Dad had beaten him up, and in fact, they had never stopped. And this starts a very long discussion. So if you remember from the first trial, Lyle figured out that Dad was doing these things to Erik and told his dad to stop doing it. And Lyle or Jose apparently said, "Okay, sure, whatever you say, son." Maybe he just said that to get him off his back. And so Lyle believed his dad and thought, "Okay, yeah, it stopped then because he said it was going to." But now he's finding out 8 years later his dad lied and it's continued. So Lyle says, "You're my brother and I can't let this go on, and I'm going to take care of you, and I'm going to be your big brother. I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to sit down and talk to Dad. I'm going to tell him this has to stop. I'm going to get his permission for the two of us to live together here. Either I'll transfer, I'll go to UCLA, or you can come back there in Princeton. You can go to Princeton, okay?" Now, it's just like that. You can just go to Princeton, okay? Now, as good as news as that might seem on the surface, that Erik is hearing that his brother believes him and supports him and is going to intervene about their family, it actually resulted in making him extremely frightened because he knew he had carried this secret for so many years. He knew how serious his father was about never revealing it. And he knew that he had been threatened with death if he did. His father said, "I'll kill you if you tell anyone, especially if he tells Lyle." So, especially Lyle. Like, I'll take your life no matter who you tell, but especially Lyle. Don't tell Lyle. So, that's what he had been threatened with his whole life since he was about 6 years old. And that's why he got beaten up when he was 10. His father thought he had told Lyle. He hadn't. But Erik doesn't tell Lyle on Tuesday that his father had threatened to take his life if he ever told him, because he doesn't want Lyle to know that. He's just put Lyle in jeopardy. So he doesn't want to tell Lyle that there was this threat because he doesn't even want Lyle to be part of the target of Jose. So now on Wednesday, Lyle went to his mother's seeking her help in this problem between the father and Erik. He went to her and he told her what was going on between Mr. Menendez and Erik, and he tried to get her help in stopping it. And she was angry and denied it and refused to hear him out. So she just stopped him and probably left or made him leave. On Thursday, August 7th, that was the day that Mr. Menendez was due back home. Erik left the house in the late afternoon, expecting that his father would return as scheduled at 6, but he didn't get back then, and Erik kept calling in with increasing anxiety because he doesn't know what's going to happen when his brother sits down and says to his father, "Stop having sex with your son." He doesn't think this is going to go over well. So he's got more anxiety about the confrontation, although he keeps fantasizing that it will. So he keeps calling in. He finds out that his father's flight was delayed, and I think we even have the airline records to show how delayed it was. But it winds up that Mr. Menendez didn't return until close to 11. Erik gets home even later than that. Lyle isn't answering the phone when he calls to find out what happened. He doesn't find Lyle. He gets home and looks for him, doesn't see him. So Erik goes up in his room And a little while later, his father is at the door banging, demanding entry, and he sounds angry. And Erik opens the door. The door's locked. Everybody in the family lived with the doors locked. Erik unlocks the door, as he always did when his father demanded entry, and his father comes in and explodes at him over telling Lyle. And why did you tell him? And I told you what I would do if you told him. And Lyle is now going to tell everybody. And Erik is saying, no, he won't, Dad. No, he won't. I know he won't tell everybody. And Mr. Menendez says, I don't believe you. I know you're going to tell. It's too late. So just that right there might make you think, yeah, he might come after me because he knows it's too late, or, it's not going to, I don't know. He doesn't believe that we're never going to say anything else to anybody. Um, and because we spoke, we're in jeopardy. And he keeps getting more enraged, and as Erik tries to argue with him, no, no, you're overreacting. It's not going to happen. His father finally grabs him and pushes him, and they bang into furniture, and Erik runs out of the room. And he went as far as looking again for his brother to find out what in the world went on in this conversation, and he finds his mother is watching. He fears the television on now, or he hears, sorry, he hears the television on now in the den, and he goes into the den, and there's his mother, and he's hysterical and crying. And see, he doesn't know that Lyle had told his mother that the day before about the conversation that Lyle intended to have with his father on Thursday. I know this sounds very complicated, but as it comes out, it will hopefully be more understandable. But the fact is that Erik doesn't know that Lyle Menendez, the subject matter of the conversation to his mother. So when he is in the den with her and she says, what's wrong with you? He says, you wouldn't understand. And she then tells him she does understand, she knows exactly what's going on, and she's known what's gone on all along. So she's always feigned ignorant, but we find out she's known all along. Because, of course, she's obsessed with Jose. So when Jose's missing and in the boys' room, she notices. Guarantee she notices stuff like that. All right, moving on. And he just can't believe it. And he's angry and he tells her, I hate you. And he cries even worse and he runs away. When he told her he hated her, she starts screaming how she's the victim in the family and she's really the one who's been mistreated and on and on. She does appear to Erik at this time to be intoxicated. She's often drinking or on pills. And you will hear testimony in this case that she was taking pills to excess. She was hospitalized at one point for an overdose of drugs, and she, in her own handwriting, admits to having a drinking problem and to drinking too much and to getting drunk. And on this occasion, she appears to him that way, to Erik that way. In any event, instead of continuing to argue with her, he runs out of the house and he sees the lights are on in the guest house and he runs down there to talk to Lyle because he's very frightened now that his father is going to make good on all of his threats, and he meets up with Lyle. And unfortunately, his mother is still angry with him and yelling at him, and she catches up and she and Lyle have an argument, and this is just a huge emotional fracas. And finally, after angry words between Mrs. Menendez and Lyle, Mrs. Menendez leaves and the two sons are left there in the guest house that Thursday night. Here is Erik, who since 6 has kept his secret. When he told his cousin Andy, Andy was only 10 years old. Okay, so they were 10, sorry. Well, Erik was a little bit older than Andy, I think. But they're similar in age. So he told Andy, and Andy was only 10 years old at the time, and he never repeated it to anyone. So Andy never told anybody about it until he testified about it. And he certainly never repeated it to Mr. Menendez, and now he has told the secret, and his father knows he's told. And in the course of, and then over the next few minutes, while he's in the guest house with Lyle, Lyle tells him what happened in the confrontation between Lyle and Mr. Menendez that set Mr. Menendez off and made him attack Erik. And what Erik hears, of course, all the alarm bells are going off because what happened was Lyle had spent the day writing out what he was going to say to his father. And you will hear witnesses who will tell you that Lyle would prepare for talks with his father. And then the court says, let's finish off here. Miss Abramson says, without going into more detail, get into the general picture. Let's finish off. Miss Abramson says, sorry. Well, Judge, if I'm going to go through the things I need to go through, it will still take me. He says, you're summarizing too much detail. Let's get to the more general. Miss Abramson says, all right, I shall be more general. I have 2 seconds to scan the page to see what is the crucial generality that I need to tell you before I can move on and not lose you all. All right, what happens that Thursday night when the two Menendez brothers talk about the crisis they feel there is that they feel they're in? Sorry, start that sentence over. What happens that Thursday night when the two Menendez brothers talk about the crisis they feel they're in is they both become convinced that both of their parents would rather see them dead than ever let this scandal such as incest be told about them. They share recollections about their childhood. They share their understanding of what their mother's interest and status and what people think of her, their father's incredible ambition, and they are very struck with the notion that what has happened here because in the conversation with his father, Lyle tells Erik he told his father that he would tell the world if he doesn't stop, and that's what set his father off threatening to tell. That's what convinces him that they truly are in danger. And they spend hours talking about how to get out of this. And this, Dr. Wilson will tell you, is ultimately the true damaging effect of abuse. The fact that you get people in these crisis situations and they can't rationally think their way out of it. They have all of these deficits that I talked about before, and here the Menendez brothers are going through their options. There's nowhere to run, and they will explain to you why they felt that way. There's nowhere to hide. These are very rich, very powerful, who can travel all over the country, who do that all the time. Mrs. Menendez was able to track down her husband's mistress even though she was living on the other side of the country. So they don't feel they can ever run away from the parents. And when Erik tried, they caught him and told him, you're never leaving. They don't believe anyone in the family will believe them. They don't believe that the police would believe them. You know, these rich kids from Beverly Hills are being molested. That's only supposed to happen in poor families. So they don't know what to do to protect themselves from what they think is a real threat of death at the hands of very violent people. What they decide to do is to buy guns to defend themselves. And what they intend to do is buy handguns because there are events planned with these with their parents, particularly a trip they're supposed to go on with them that Saturday, and they're terribly afraid of being around their parents and not being able to protect themselves. So Thursday night, Erik stays in the guest house. They're going to go buy guns the next day. And the next day, on Friday, they start an odyssey that takes them to 3 different gun stores. In the course of those visits, they find out they cannot buy handguns. There's a 2 week waiting period, and they don't think they're going to live 2 weeks. So they eventually wind up down in the La Jolla area, which is a beautiful area, by the way. I've been to San Diego a couple times for work in the past, and oh my gosh, love it. Love the area. La Jolla is very nearby. Just wonderful weather and sun and just nice, beachy relaxed vibe in San Diego, La Jolla area. All right, they get off the freeway there at a gun store. They visit two gun stores in that area and they buy shotguns. And what they end up buying that Friday to defend themselves is what is called birdshot. Dove load is called teeny weeny little pellets. I don't know. That's what's for sale on the floor of the Big Five. They are totally unfamiliar with the operation of guns, and that's what they buy and take back with them. On the way down there, there's lengthy conversations between Eric Menendez and Lyle Menendez in which Eric actually gives Lyle all the details he can bear to share about the kind of violence that has punctured the sexual molestation over the years. Punctuated, sorry, that has punctuated sexual molestation over the years, which further alarms Lyle because now he knows, which he never wanted to know, which is how dangerous his father is, how physically threatening he had been over all the years towards his brother Eric. As you know, Lyle was like the golden boy up on a pedestal. Um, he treated Lyle with a lot of respect, care. I mean, he was still very like controlling and manipulative and forceful with Lyle, but at least, and he also abused Lyle too when Lyle was a young boy, so let's not forget that. But at the same time, he treated Lyle like he was the golden child and Eric was basically nothing, and, he used him for his own gratification. All right, so on Saturday, what the brothers do is they leave the home and they go to a gun store here in Van Nuys called, well, you'll hear Detective Zoller's familiar with it, and he'll testify about what it, he'll testify about it when I ask him. So, speaking of Detective Zoller, overwhelmingly, all of you guys want his entire testimony read. We will do so. I'm not opposed to doing so. It just might take a few tries here because we will. He's on the stand for a few days. So we'll get through it, and I don't have a problem reading it. I would rather have your input, and that's exactly why I have um, those polls. I'll have some more polls coming soon, so just stay tight and keep an eye out for those. In addition to reading all through Detective Zoller, he's the lead detective, by the way. Detective Zoller's testimony we'll read through, but also we'll read through the arguments. You guys overwhelmingly also wanted to hear the arguments between the lawyers when, like, the jury's out and things like that. So I think there's a lot of good information that we can glean from that regarding the way that the defense is treated and what kind of evidence comes in, what they have to argue about regarding that evidence. So we'll definitely be going through that. All right, continuing on, Leslie says, but there's a gun store here in Van Nuys that has a firing range. It advertises in the yellow pages, and they went there. Eric with the notion that he had never owned a gun like this. He had never owned any gun. He had never fired a gun like this. He didn't even know if he could figure out how to make it work. And he told Lyle Thursday night, when they're talking about buying guns to defend themselves, what Eric says to Lyle is, I don't think I could kill my mother even in self defense. And Mr. Khan objects. He says it's argumentative. Court says overruled. That's not an argument. Whatever. That's why it was overruled. All right. So Ms. Abramson says, and Eric said, even if I really believed she was going to kill me, I don't really believe I could ever take her life. Okay, that's the reference on that tape that Mr. Khan would have you interpret a different way, I suggest. Not really sure. I'm not sure what context exactly they're saying, but it must have been something he said in the tape, in the Dr. Oziel tapes, um, that he must have said something where Mr. Khan is twisting it to be like, oh, well, he said he did it. I don't know. All right. So, but in any event, one thing he does know is he doesn't think he can operate this gun, so he wants to go to his to this gun store in order to try and see if he can be taught how to work it and how to fire it. As it turns out, they get there and you can't use a shotgun in an indoor firing range, which is what they have. While they're there, the people in the store, they talk to them about the fact that they bought guns for protection and they'll tell them Lyle has a discussion with the salesperson that they bought birdshot ammunition and the people are the ones who tell them if you want ammunition to protect him, to protect yourselves, and they were talking about protecting themselves from burglars at the time, you should buy number 4 buckshot. There's even larger buckshot than number 4. They bought one box of what the people in the store told them to buy. Now, the Friday night, the nights before, I've told you now on Saturday morning, they went and did this gun store thing and they ride around for a long time because they're trying to delay getting home. Why are they doing that Saturday? Because Erik Menendez will tell you that on Friday night, after they came back from this long trip down south, their mother told them that this fishing trip that had been planned for Saturday for the family, a shark fishing trip, had been delayed. That they weren't leaving in the late morning, that the trip was rescheduled for late in the afternoon, and that they'd be out on the water at night. At this, to Erik Menendez in the condition that he's in at the time with tense fears translates to him that the parents are planning to take their lives on the fishing trip on Saturday. So they hang around. They come back late on Saturday in the hopes of avoiding the trip altogether, only to find that their parents are waiting for them to go. So they go on the fishing trip. And you will hear that testimony in this case of the captain of the fishing boat, which is a very small boat indeed, Mr. Anderson, not to be confused with family Anderson. There's a Brian Anderson who's the fishing boat, and a Brian Anderson with an EN who is the brother of Kitty. So this is the small boat guy, Mr. Anderson and his friend, Mr. Gaskell, who were on the boat, and they will describe how peculiar this family was acting towards each other on this trip. How the two sons are wearing shorts. It's cold, it's choppy, it's windy, and they're spending this entire night time this entire nighttime trip perched out on the front end of the boat, like in the bow of the boat outside getting washed over with the waves, shivering, cold, gloomy, and what Erik will tell you is they were staying that far away because they were convinced that somehow their parents were going to get rid of them on this trip. And here they are shivering and cold and scared at the front of the boat. They get back home. They're not, obviously the parents did not take their lives. They don't understand why they're not demised at this point or deceased at this point, and they talk about more about what is going on. What do we think is going on here? And they leave the house and go off to talk about what should they do now to avoid what they think is partial or a parental plan to take their lives. They think that their parents are plotting to take their lives at this time. And what they decide is they're going to stay apart all day Sunday because they're convinced the parents will do it them both at the same time. So if they stay separated, then that's going to keep them from acting it out. But obviously that's not a very logical thing, but still, you can't in their situation, they're not thinking logically. They're thinking out of panic and fear. So they come back home Saturday night after making that decision, and they haven't picked up a key to get back in the house, and they were never allowed to own their own keys. This was something we learned about also. There was a drawer that had keys sometimes, and you had to take your key from there and you had to always put it back. This is how controlling they were. The brothers did not even have their own house keys to get in the house. And if they came home and the parents weren't home, they were just out of luck unless they had a way to break in. But most of the time they were stuck. and they haven't picked up a key to get back in the house, and they were never allowed to own their own keys to the house. Part of the way that they were kept dependent on the parents. So they have to ring the bell, wake their mother up so that she'll let them back in the house. When she does, she's very angry with them. In the course of that argument, she says to Erik that if he had only kept his mouth shut, things might have worked out in the family. If you had only kept your mouth shut, our family wouldn't be destroyed. It's all your fault. And Erik understands that in only one way that things have not worked out in the family, that the parents don't want them to work out, and that their thoughts, his and Lyle's, that they're going to be that their lives are going to be taken are indeed true. So it confirms again, like he takes that as that's another confirmation as she's going to take our lives. They're planning this thing because our family doesn't work out anymore. On Sunday, Erik separates from his brother, as he had planned to do, and basically he stays away the entire day into the night. And the idea was that Lyle would stay at home and see what his parents were doing and see if they talked to him and diffuse what felt like the insane crisis in their lives. But in fact, over the course of the day, as Erik finds out, later, the things that his father does say to Lyle are even more ominous. Things like the future that Lyle was planning doesn't matter anymore. Things like Lyle going to this camp, this training thing that his father wanted to do, doesn't matter or doesn't count anymore. So, things that were important in the future, things that did matter or that would have mattered to to Jose, definitely Jose showed no interest in anymore. Like it doesn't matter anymore. So things like that could, especially if you're already thinking your parents are going to off you, hearing that is you're just going to hear it in the same way. That yes, this is confirmation. And beyond that, Lyle talked to Perry Berman, who you've heard Mr. Khan refer to. And Lyle was home the whole day waiting to see what's going to happen. If anything, what his parents, if anything, are going to say or do. But he makes arrangements with Perry Berman to meet him later that night. And during the telephone call he actually has with Perry, Perry says that he had called the house earlier, that Mr. Menendez had immediately picked up the phone, picked up Lyle's line. Remember, parents had access to every line in the house. Lyle had his own. So he picked up Lyle's line because they all had their own phone lines in that house, and that Mr. Menendez had told Perry that Lyle wasn't home. Perry had indicated that he wanted to make plans with Lyle for that evening, and Mr. Menendez told Perry that Lyle wasn't at home. So Lyle, in telling the story to Erik, tells Erik that he interpreted that as his father's effort to isolate him and keep him there alone that day and to not let him leave the house that night. Which, yes, you could interpret it that way now. In any event, especially if you're a victim of his, anything that he does, you're going to see as somewhat nefarious. In any event, the upshot is that Erik has a story to tell Lyle at this point on Sunday also, because Erik left the house early. He didn't have a chance to tell Lyle before Sunday that Saturday night after their argument with their mother, Erik was up in his bedroom and has the shotgun in his bedroom when his father again comes pounding on the door, but this time, for the first time, he doesn't let him in. Instead, Erik is sitting on the bed and he will show you he has circled already once before. And he'll show you again on a photograph here that he's sitting on the bed in his bedroom with a shotgun, which has birdshot loaded in it, so the wrong ammo, 2 rounds or 3 rounds from when he bought it on Friday, terrified that his father going to kick in the door. He's sitting there with a loaded gun and he's afraid of his father coming into the door. He doesn't open the door for him. His father doesn't doesn't kick in the door. He says, "Well, you have to come out of there sooner or later," and he leaves. And it is Only later on Sunday that Erik is able to tell Lyle that story. Now, by the time Erik comes back from being away all day long and shares with Lyle these things in the behavior of their parents that scared the both of them, he has spent the better part of the week not sleeping, the better part of the week having nightmares, the better part of the week convinced that all the fears he had about his parents all of his life being were being realized, sorry. All of those fears of his life were being realized at this time. He decided that things are so dangerous now that the now that this has got to be the day and the time when their parents in fact are going to make good on what they see is threats to take their lives. Because what Mr. Menendez said to Lyle, according to what Lyle tells Erik on Thursday, hold on. He just, sorry, I like to pause when the dog's being noisy because I feel like it's just a distraction. So sorry about that. All right, so he decided that things are so dangerous now that this has got to be the day and the time when their parents, in fact, are going to make good on the threats to take their lives because what Mr. Menendez said to Lyle, according to what Lyle tells Erik on Thursday night, when Lyle says, I'm going to tell the world if you don't stop, Mr. Menendez said Erik made his choice, you made your choice, and I've made my choice. And Lyle had no doubt that that was a threat of death. And on Sunday, August 20th, with all of this coming together in the perception of Erik Menendez and seeing his brother, who he always thought was strong, as frightened as he was, they decided at this point that they have got to get out of the house. So they're going to leave, they're going to meet Perry, but they don't want to just sneak out because they're afraid that any move on their part that conveys to their parents that they are afraid will bring down an attack. So they go to the house, to the big house, to tell the parents that they're going to the movies, and their parents tell them, You're not leaving. And this is amazing. This is Sunday in the summer. They're not going to school. They don't have to be anywhere. And in Erik Menendez's mind, this can't mean anything. For the parents to say at this time, you're staying here, you're not leaving, only confirms everything else that he had been thinking about what was going on between them. So it only confirms that fear. So more anxiety, I'm sure, to build up in the brothers. And an argument ensues in the entryway of the home involving all four members of the family. There's the mother and the father, and Lyle and Erik. And first, the mother tells them they're not leaving the house. Then the father comes out of the den and says they're not leaving the house. And then the father says to Erik, Go up to your room. I'll be right there. And Erik interprets this as any other time when his father ordered him to his room as a precursor to an assault of some kind. Now, in his head, he is so panic stricken at the time, he doesn't know if his mother's going to send him to his room and then molest him, or send him to his room and attack him, or send him to his room and take his life. I think that was supposed to say father, but not mother there. And what happens next is that Lyle says to his father, You're not going to touch him again. You're not going to touch my little brother, Erik. Don't go up to your room. And then Mr. Menendez says, in front of everyone, if in front of Lyle, in front of his wife, You can't tell me what to do with my own son. You can't tell me what to do in my family. Now, what Dr. Wilson will tell you, what Erik himself will tell you, is when you've been keeping this dark and shameful secret for all these years, it has this magical power for you. This is an argument where a secret is completely out there. His father is virtually admitting that he molested him, that he's done the crime in front of every other member of the family, in front of his wife, and that to Erik is the most single dangerous aspect of everything that happened all week. Of course, now he can say it because we're dead. It doesn't matter now if he admits it to me, admits it to Lyle, admits it in front of Lyle. We're not going to live to be witnesses to this. Mr. Khan objects, says it's argumentative. The court says, all right, let's finish. We still have 20 pages, so uh, Ms. Abramson says, thank you. That's what's in his state of mind, and that's what triggers the most extreme aspect of what's been a week of panic. And by the end of the case, after you've heard Eric's testimony, we'll have for you a chart of the levels of fear and what the various items were that happened by way of speech and by way of behavior that led to those levels of fear over the course of the week. But Eric, nevertheless obedient, starts going up the stairs towards his room when his father tells him to do that. Then his father leaves, goes into the den, and his mother gets into an argument with Lyle, and she's accusing Lyle of having ruined the family, and it's all Lyle's fault. Do these people seem like good people? The parents, I mean, don't feel sorry for them. I mean, are they victims? I guess, but did they bring it upon themselves? Absolutely. There's consequences. They didn't feel the consequences of our law, so they felt the consequences of what happens when you instill fear in your child like that. Hold on. And then his father comes out and grabs Mrs. Menendez and tells her, don't worry, pulls her into the den and closes the door. At this point, both Lyle Menendez and Erik Menendez are convinced that they are about to die at the hands of their parents, obviously. It doesn't matter if, I mean, as Dr. Wilson will tell you, it doesn't matter what it looks like to you or I at this point. So if you and I thought, this is just some mundane fight that they're having, blah, 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 no big worries. It doesn't matter what we think because we don't live that life. We're not in the brother's shoes. We don't know how Jose actually treats the brothers, and so it's all on their perception as to whether they were afraid or not. So whether you or I would be afraid in that situation doesn't matter. It's whether they are. And they talk a lot about that in the first trial. I'm sure they'll try to cover that here too. So as she says, it doesn't matter if, I mean, as Dr. Wilson will tell you, it doesn't matter what it looks like to you or I at this point. You have to be inside the mind of someone suffering from post traumatic stress disorder with all the triggers and cues that he will point out to you that were going on that week to understand how you can completely lose it and panic at that point. And that is what happened because at that point, Erik is on the staircase. Lyle comes running up the stairs, obviously frightened out of his mind. Erik is saying to Lyle, I'm not going back in my room. I'm not going to let him come at me in the room. And Lyle says, there's no time for that. It's happening now. They're taking our lives. And what they then do is they both run and get their guns and and they stuff in some of the buckshot. So remember at the beginning, prosecutor actually explained it really well. So there's buckshot and there's birdshot. The birdshot has a lot of little itty bitty pellets. The buckshot has less larger pellets inside. So when it hits the target, it explodes and the pellets go in all sorts of directions in your target. So if you're hunting a deer or something, then it's more likely, you need the bigger buckshots, the bigger pellets to do the damage. So that's the difference between that. So they get the buckshot ammunition that they had bought that morning. So this is at the other place that had the firing range, but they weren't allowed to go in because they couldn't use their shotguns. But they told them to use the right ammunition, which would be buckshot. If they were, did I lose my highlight? If they had been using it for protection, buckshot, they told them buckshot was better. And what they then do is they both run and get their guns and they stuff in some of the buckshot ammunition that they had bought that morning and they run for the doors of the den. And after they open the doors of the den, Erik sees there are no lights on in the den. What's on is the television set, this big television set. And he sees, before he ever fires the gun, he sees a standing shadowy figure. And Erik will tell you that when he was a child, his father would sometimes, in the middle of the night after he came home late from work, creep into his bedroom and silently molest him, never saying a word. And the way he would appear was as this shadowy figure. And here he walks into the den in this state of panic, and he sees that same shadowy figure from his childhood. This is all new information that we did not know. But as time progresses and they're able to do more interviews, depositions, investigating of this case, more and more comes out. So this is a detail that we didn't have in the first trial about the shadowy figure, but now we do. So believing he sees the shadowy figure from his childhood, and it is then that he fires the gun, believing he is in imminent danger or death or great bodily injury or to come. So he fires, he stands still, he crosses the room, he stands in front of the coffee table, between the coffee table and the television set, and he'll testify that he fired straight ahead. He will testify that he didn't aim at anything in particular, that he fired in a general direction where he knew both of his parents were, that he had no thoughts or calculations in his head at that time, not even an intention to take their lives, just a persuasive awareness of terror and a feeling that he needed to survive. Now, you will see from the photographs in this case how close together the houses on Elm Drive in Beverly Hills are. Here are these two people in this room that's approximately 17 by 25, firing off two 12-gauge shotguns in a residential area where the next house you could spit at. As the evidence will show, and you will hear from the neighbors how they all heard. There's more than one neighbor. There's half a dozen neighbors who heard the sounds of the shooting. They heard rapid succession pop, 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 pop. They thought it was fireworks. They didn't call the police, even though police headquarters was less than a mile away from this house where these people are using shotguns in this room in this residential neighborhood. You will hear testimony that the Beverly Hills Police Department does patrol its residential areas. There are also private patrols that patrol these neighborhoods. And so you will hear Erik Menendez tell you that all of those facts, given all of those factors, he expected the police to show up any second after they were done firing in that room. And he and his brother waited. They waited, expecting the police to show up. And when no one came, that's when they decided for the first time to leave and not tell what they did. And they went back to the den and did not pick up all of the evidence. In fact, as the testimony here would show, no one picked up all of the evidence in that crime scene, neither them nor the police department. What they did was they went in to pick up shell casings because they thought maybe there were fingerprints on the shell casings. That's all they thought. They didn't know anything about gunshot residue. They didn't know then that their hands could have been tested at any time by the police that night, and it would have shown they had done this. Because if they did a gunshot residue test, which they failed to do, the brothers would have obviously failed because they hadn't even like tried to wash their hands or anything like that. They do go and hide the guns. They get rid of the guns, but they don't really clean themselves up from the crime. So they, as you can tell, it's not like they planned it out. It's not like this perfect crime where they had clothes planned and, they didn't even think of that. They didn't even think of gunshot residue. The shell casings Lyle left in his car because the state's going to try to claim that this was pre-planned and all that, but they didn't. I mean, there were so many messy mistakes that somebody who would be planning this probably would have thought out ahead of time. like the shell casings were in Lyle's car when the police show up and they want to search his car, obviously. He was able to sneak and get into his car without without the officers noticing him. But anyways, so yeah, so the shell casings they pick up because they thought maybe there were fingerprints. They didn't know anything about the gunshot residue that was on their hands. They didn't know then that their hands could have been tested at any time, but they got lucky because the Beverly Hills Police Department didn't test them for gunshot residue that night. Why? Big flaw on their part, because they could have solved it that night. In any event, they picked up the shell casings, and to do that, they turn on the lights in the family room. And when Eric Menendez goes back into the family room, into the den, and starts looking for the shell casings, which he will tell you were all grouped in the area where he was standing because the gun ejects to the right, and all the shells were close to where he had been standing. For the first time, he could see well enough into the room to see that his parents were not armed. Something that he believed before he went into the room was true, that they had guns, that they had rifles in the house. Two of them were up in the closet in Mrs. Menendez's closet. He knew that she had that gun. He had been with her a year before when she bought that gun and told him that she was buying the gun in order to take somebody out with it. That's what she told him when she bought one of the two 22 caliber rifles that they had. And it's when he saw that there were no guns that he realized coming down from his panic that he had been completely mistaken, that even though everything terrifying that had happened over that week genuinely frightened him nearly to death, he realized that his parents at that moment at least were not in the process of taking his life. But we don't know that for sure. They could have been plotting. I'm just going to leave it out there and say it's a possibility, given what we know about Jose. And if he was with RCA and he's with powerful people with RCA, they're not going to want those things coming out. RCA might even want to cover it up, perhaps, if they know. So, I mean, there's a lot of reasons to believe that the parents might have done something horrible to the brothers, even if it was just like being really punished severely, to the point where, they were abused, um, quite severely. But anyhow, we don't know what the intentions were of the parents and what they were talking about. They were not seated on the couch as the prosecution wants you to believe. They were standing in an upright position, in between, like the door to the room and between the couch and coffee table. And they were Lyle and Eric both specifically remember them standing. So that's something different than what the prosecution says. So far, though, as we're reading through this, the defense's theory has not changed. We might have a few more details that we didn't have before, but overall, their theory is the same. It's the same excuse, or not excuse, but the same defense of, imperfect self-defense, it seems. So, um, at least, usually the one who changes their theory for the second trial is the one who has the weaker case. So I don't think the defense is changing their strategy here. All right, and that's when he saw that there were no guns. He was mistaken. That even though everything terrifying that had happened over that week genuinely frightened him nearly to death, he realized that his parents, at that moment at least, were not in the process of taking his life. And over the course of the next hour, where he and Lyle ran around making an alibi for themselves because they didn't want to get arrested, but more importantly, what were they going to tell people now when they realized they were wrong, they were mistaken? He was convinced that nobody would believe them as to what had happened and what had propelled the shooting. So they went to the movie complex. This is part of their alibi. They tried to buy tickets. They found out that they couldn't. They were trying to buy tickets to Batman because they had already seen Batman. So they figured they would be able to explain what the movie was about if somebody asked. But the showing that they wanted the tickets for, which would have absolved them from, with their alibi, they weren't able to get because it was past the time. So they found out that they couldn't get those tickets, but they found out which movies had been sold out and which movies had not been sold out. And later on, they incorporated that information in the statements that they gave to the police. They threw away the guns. They testified. Eric will testify exactly where he threw away the gun. He threw away some clothing out in Santa Monica. Okay, so they did throw some clothing away. They had gone to Santa Monica to try to meet up with Perry Berman. They were too late. They called him from a payphone out in Santa Monica. They later told the police they had made that call. The police verified it with records and later that morning strike that after being out in Santa Monica, after dumping some shotgun shells, the bird shot from the day before from the purchase on Friday, after throwing away some clothes that he noticed little bitty spots on, they went back home. So they did throw away some clothes, but they hadn't been like totally prepared for that. It wasn't like, they had something to cover themselves or they didn't have a plan. It was all acting out on uh pure adrenaline and emotion and survival. And they were supposed to meet up with Perry Berman. And Eric couldn't do it. He couldn't. He was falling apart and he didn't want to go to a restaurant and meet up with Perry and pretend anything. He wanted to go home and call the police, and that's what they did. And you will hear his voice and Lyle Menendez's voice on the 911 tape. You will decide whether or not the hysteria that you hear is the hysteria of people who have done a shocking thing and are themselves upset about it. You will hear the testimony of police officers who saw their condition and believed that they were truly hysterical. So it is possible to take the life of your abuser and also grieve them at the same time, especially when that person is a parent. So it's possible for them to be upset and be grieving and be in shock of the whole thing as well as having done it. So it's not inconsistent. You will hear the testimony of Detective Edmonds, who interviewed Eric Menendez, and you will hear that tape where he is hysterical and starts to cry in the end. Mr. Khan wants to tell you all this is faking. Eric Menendez will tell you none of it was faking. And over the next weeks and months, you will hear from witnesses how remorseful and how guilt stricken Eric Menendez was. He lost 30 pounds. He had new and recurrent nightmares. He was uh, he had thoughts of self-deletion. He told the police things when they interviewed him in September. He was telling them clues, huge hints that he was responsible for the crimes, and they didn't hear them or didn't follow up on them. So he was giving clues, hints, and he's like, "Yeah, come and get me, guys." And they didn't. They did not follow through or pick up on it, I guess. And then there was the conversation with this person, Oziel. Now, there you go, Barry. Thank you. Barry must have been putting up a slide or something. Mr. Khan enlarged one excerpt of this and then he characterized the rest of it for you. I've enlarged another excerpt of this, but let me just show you now so you know what's coming. This is a long tape. This is what the transcript of this entire tape actually looks like. There are just 2 pages of this. And when this tape is like, when you hear it, as Mr. Khan indicated, Oziel is not going to be called by the prosecution in this case. They're just going to put on this tape and start playing it for you. And it starts in the middle of a conversation. Sorry, I had a phone. My phone was ringing and it stopped. Um, sorry. And it starts in the middle of a conversation. It's not that there's no introduction, it just starts in the middle with voices and it ends the same way. It's just the tape just stops even though folks are still talking. On the face of it, what emerges from this tape, you will hear that Oziel on this tape, the person that Detective Zoller identifies as Oziel on this tape, is doing most of the talking. He is coming up with theories that he is floating past Erik and Lyle Menendez as to why it is that Erik and Lyle Menendez took their parents' lives. One thing that I can assure you in listening to that entire tape, the words spoken by Erik and Lyle Menendez on that tape does not add one fact, one item of proof to the prosecution's theory that these homicides were motivated by greed or hatred or any based emotion. The tape does, however, have some highly irrational suggestions, crazy stuff basically suggested by Dr. Oziel repeatedly that Mrs. Menendez that her life was taken. Here's how it goes. Here's Mr. Oziel's theory that Mrs. Menendez's life was taken because she already had thoughts of self-deletion and that Mr. Menendez had his life taken because he made the mother think those thoughts. Okay? Now, and that's Dr. Oziel's theory. So now that's what I mean by it sounds irrational on the face of it. So you know right away that you're not listening to something where people are necessarily telling the truth and you're not listening to something where the person asking the questions is actually asking the questions. You will hear over and over again that Oziel poses the questions and answers them himself. He's very self-important, and he did a lot of talking in the first trial on the stand. He was very annoying. Um, by the end of his testimony, I couldn't stand the guy. I don't have a nice thing to say about it. All right, so Erik Menendez will explain when he testifies that this partially taped conversation, because there was conversation before this tape went on, at the time of this conversation that Erik would not and could not tell this Oziel person the real reasons why his parents' lives were taken. He was feeling, as you will hear when you hear this tape, extreme guilt and remorse. He was still feeling a sense of loyalty to his parents, and that, more than anything else, prevented him from uh, putting on anything negative about his parents on the tape. The brothers don't talk badly about their parents. They uh, on the stand, they were very hesitant to say anything negative. He freely admits that and takes blah, 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 start over. He freely admits and takes responsibility for the fact that he took the lives of their parents on this tape, but he refuses to say. He refuses to listen to anyone else saying negative things about his parents, and he refuses to reveal in this conversation his parents' flaws or their crimes or their cruelties. Now, if you listen closely, you will hear that he offers no excuses whatsoever for what he did, and he does not accept Oziel's tortured and illogical excuses. You will hear how, towards the end of the tape, Erik Menendez is losing control of himself. He's crying during the making of this tape, and he will tell you that at that point, the truth is beginning to come out, and that because it is important to protect the memory of his parents, and he and Lyle want the conversation to end before he spills out the truth that his parents did these terrible things to them. That is why Lyle, after resisting Oziel's misinformed impression of why the shooting happened, finally agrees with Oziel just to end it. Finally, Lyle says, "Yeah, you're right. He was controlling. He was this. He was that," to end the discussion. On the tape, they just kind of appease Oziel just to get him to stop. So now I ask you to carefully scrutinize who was saying what on this tape. Erik says very, very little throughout the course of this tape, and the assumption that emerges here, if you listen to this, is, well, your mother was so she had so many thoughts of self deletion at the time, she didn't want to live. None of that has to do with 1989. As I indicated to you, the time when Mrs. Menendez was that way was in 1986 and 87. In fact, she's even hospitalized in 1987 for drug overdose. But there's nothing about self deletion about her in 1989. She's completely reconciled with her husband at that time. There's no more crying and moaning about the affair that was so devastating to her. Instead, the people will tell you that in seeing them there, totally lovey dovey, and she seems to be more alive with him than ever before. As you may recall from the trial, they were never affectionate or lovey dovey up until this point in time, up until like the last few years of their life. So it's very interesting. I think she threatened to leave him or tell the secret. Once she knew that that was the thing that she could control him with, I think she got her way of uh, keeping him close and making sure that she felt loved and got the affection that she wanted. So historically, we'll show you that the facts that are discussed on this tape do not support any of the facts about what was really going on at the time the parents' lives were taken and could not have provided a motive. And the brothers would not. I mean, by saying these things in light of that, it's Oziel who keeps saying these things. Now, here's what happens though. Towards the end, before Lyle agrees with Oziel and ends it on page 27, Oziel's been going on saying nasty things about Mr. Menendez, that he's domineering, that he's this and that, and here is proof of what he's been saying and what Erik will tell you. He loved his parents in spite of what they did to him. Took their lives from fear and not from hatred, and he's loyal even to them in death. Oziel is saying negative things about Mr. Menendez, and here's Erik saying, I don't like hearing these things about my father. And Oziel asks Erik Menendez, how are you feeling? And he says upset, and you can hear him on the tape. He's crying through this. And Erik says, my father, my mother were two people that I loved, and I just don't want to hear anything negative about them. This is a guilty conscience. This is remorse. This is a child who knows he's made a monstrous mistake. Mr. Khan says objection, argumentative. The court sustains it and says that's argumentative. Let's finish it off. Ms. Abramson says, sorry, Your Honor, but at this point, more importantly, here Erik will tell you the truth is coming out and he doesn't want to hear these bad things about his parents, and he doesn't want to hear it sound like he could have ever coldly have taken their lives. So he's beginning to say truthful things, what he says, and he says it over and over again about the time. At the time their lives were taken, he had no choice. He had no choice. I would have taken any other choice. I very much regret it. I may not have had a choice at the time, but I regret it now. And again, I don't like hearing my father put in this sort of way. He was somebody that I loved and almost had no choice to do what I did. And I hate myself for doing it because of the love that I had for him and my mother. Now, had no choice is the way Erik as was expressing there that he acted in the actual, however mistaken, belief of the need to defend himself. Had he chosen or had no choice is self-defense. Had no choice is not mercy, KILLing. Had no choice is not I did it for the money. If you listen carefully to this tape and take a look at the transcript, you will see and you will hear how Oziel repeatedly tries to manipulate the Menendez brothers into expressing anger and hatred towards their parents, and they never do it. They resist, they deny it. When Erik testifies, I'll take him through this, she says. I'll not go now and tell you all the things that he can point to in this tape where he's actually trying to tell the truth, and Oziel isn't hearing him and isn't picking up on what he's saying and isn't following up on it. Now, the last topic that I'm going to talk about is the crime scene. Mr. Khan told you he's going to prove it with a mafia kneecapping recreation. Mr. Khan's going to call a witness in this case called Roger McCarthy. Mr. Khan objects. Your Honor goes beyond. The court says, let's stick with the evidence you expect to introduce. Ms. Abramson says, I do. The court says, you're not calling Mr. McCarthy. Ms. Abramson says, I'm going to cross-examine Dr. McCarthy. The court says, let's go to the witnesses you're going to call. Abramson says, and I'm going to call to refute Dr. McCarthy witnesses who are experts in a field that will show you Mr. McCarthy is not an expert in. Objection, improper opening statement. Abramson says we are going to call. The court says just what you intend to prove. Cross-examination is also what I intend to prove, Your Honor. Again, you're getting into too much detail. You've gone into too much detail. Let's finish it off now. Mr. Abramson says, here it is. Last 3 pages. All right. We are going to call witnesses to describe, based on their expertise in the crime fields, or in the crucial fields that are involved in the analysis of the crime scene, who will testify and who will demonstrate to you that that the version that Erik Menendez will testify to of a random shooting in a darkened room by a panic-stricken person is entirely consistent with the condition that the crime scene was in. And I'll tell you who those people are. The first is Dr. Martin Fackler, who is a medical doctor, a surgeon, and a retired colonel of the Medical Corps of the United States of America, or Army, United States Army. And he specializes in the field of wound ballistics. And wound ballistics, he will explain, is the effects on the human body of penetrating projectiles. He served as a medical officer first in the United States Navy and then the Army for a total of 31 years. And before his retirement in 91, he was the director of Wound Ballistics Laboratory at the Letterman Army Institute of Research in San Francisco. And what I'll also prove to you is that the prosecution's witnesses acknowledge, the prosecution's witness acknowledges that Dr. Martin Fackler. Mr. Khan objects. This is improper. The court says, yes, this is argument. Just get to what you expect Dr. Fackler to testify about. She says, I'm not going to give those details, Judge. I'm going to save you from hearing, for him having to listen to that. The judge says, go on to the next witness who will testify. She says, he's the preeminent wound ballistic expert in the United States, and that is indisputable. We'll also call Mr. Charles Morton of the Institute of Forensic Scientists, a wholly qualified criminalist who specializes in ballistic evidence, blood spatter evidence, and the collection and processing of crime scene evidence. Now you're kind of getting to see that this is something that's important to her, is laying out the crime scene and the wounds and um, disproving, I guess, this mafia angle with the whole kneecapping, like they had planned this kneecapping thing, because there was no real evidence of that. So that we'll call Charles Morton of the Institute of Forensic Scientists. Mr. Morton has done investigations in many complicated criminal cases and has been involved in this case for 5 years. 5 years, the defense criminalist has examined the crime scene, and he will tell you that the conclusions that you'll hear from the prosecution's expert are, and Mr. Khan objects again, improper statement. Abramson says that's his testimony, Your Honor. The court says objection sustained. That's argument at this point. Just what his testimony will be. Abramson says, well, he will testify that the coroner who performed the autopsy and determined what were entry wounds and what were exit wounds, that his conclusions are supported by the ballistic evidence in the crime scene and are inconsistent with a set of reconstruction diagrams that have been provided to the defense by the prosecution. So, the way the prosecution is lining up the wounds is not adding up for some reason. Also testifying for the defense will be Dr. Cyril Wecht, who is one of the nation's foremost forensic pathologists, and he will review for you the findings of the coroner in the case and explain how the condition of of the defendant supports the coroner's findings. The decedent, sorry. Um, Dr. Fackler's findings and the description of the shootings offered in Erik Menendez's testimony. We also will present you with the opinion of Dr. Michael Bodden, who is another forensic pathologist who is highly regarded in the community. Dr. Michael Bodden he's like world renowned, and in a case that I've been covering on my channel more recently, he was hired by um, privately by the family of Sandra Birchmore, who we know now has been groomed since she was 15 or earlier, younger, by officers of the law. And Matthew Farwell is one of those individuals who is in jail he's the only individual in jail right now, but originally they made it seem like a self-deletion. If you don't know or aren't aware of Sandra Birchmore, they made it that the police or, their whatever experts made it seem as though it was a self-deletion. The area was staged by this officer. Um, but what happened was he strangled her and she had a broken hyoid bone, which anyone who watches Forensic Files or any of these kinds of shows knows that that is a good sign of manual strangulation and not a self-hanging. So, Dr. Bodden, even though the medical examiner had found that it was a self-deletion, Dr. Bodden said otherwise. He said it was homicide. And he has been around this long. He's a world-renowned expert in doing this job for quite some time. So even 35 whatever years ago, he was the expert, um, giving expert opinions here. Hold on one sec. So she says, we will also present you with the opinion of Dr. Michael Bodden, who is another forensic pathologist who is highly regarded in that community. When we have completed the examination of all of these witnesses, you will hear their conclusion that the kind of random and highly emotional actions of the shooters that are reflected in the condition of the crime scene is commonly called overkill. There will be testimony that a crime scene that has that appearance is often the result of extreme fear by the shooter of the targets in the shooting. In other words, the shooters are so afraid of the victims that they engage in what is called overkill. And those opinions of those experts will tie in directly with Erik Menendez's description of his parents as people that he both admired and feared, and were larger than life to him, and whom he perceived as so powerful to be above the law and incapable of being taken out. So it's interesting that he still has that view. It's like your brain says one thing, even though reality and the truth, you're staring right at the truth, but still you don't see it. So now all the testimony that we'll bring in about Eric Menendez's entire relationship with his parents is so that you will understand how that relationship, how their behavior towards him over the course of his life influenced his state of mind at the time of the shootings. I'm not going to review now again what I've said about that state of mind. I ask you to keep an open state of mind until you've heard all of the evidence to decide whether or not what he describes to you and what the physical evidence at the scene shows fits the legal definitions that the court will give you that defense or that define the definition of manslaughter. I'll say this, though, contrary to the suggestion made in Mr. Khan's final argument, Eric's belief in the incredible power and strength of his parents is what led him to ask Sergeant Edmonds hours after he had shot them, "Are they dead?" Thank you. She says. Court says, all right, thank you. Let me just remind you once again that opening statements are designed to give you a preview of what counsel expect the evidence to be throughout both the people's opening statements and the defense's opening statement. You've heard interpretations of things, impressions, and opinions. That's not evidence. Actually, none of what counsel says is evidence either side. And you still haven't heard the first witness testify, and you are the ones who will interpret the evidence after hearing it all presented to you. Did Lyle Menendez wish to make an opening statement? Mr. Gessler says, yes, Your Honor. The court says, okay, then we'll do that. How long do you think you'll be? He says, I will be between 30 and 45 minutes. So just take it back a second. He, this new team, they're public defenders because Jill Lansing, she did not stay on, unfortunately, for Lyle, which is, I think that's sad. I wish she would have. But anyways, so he gets public defenders, and you can see they put 30 to 45 minutes aside for opening statements, whereas we've just done 3.5, almost 4 hours of opening statements from Leslie Abramson, so that she can try to get Eric off of murder charges. And yet this public defender only goes 30, 40 minutes. Although I guess maybe he doesn't have to go as long because he's following up Leslie and she's so um, detailed. But I don't know. To me, I'm going to be looking for things like that because I think Jill ferociously was trying to defend her client, whereas now we've got a public defender. Not that I mean, Leslie was a public defender, and so I think was Jill, or maybe they weren't at first because they hire and use all their money on. I don't know. I don't know how that went, but I do know that they have a new lawyer, or Lyle does, and we'll see how that plays out. He says 30 or 40 minutes, I believe. The court says, okay, all right. Mr. Gessler says plus or minus a few. Court says, okay, bearing in mind we're an hour and 15 minutes over the previous time estimate, Leslie, an hour and 15 minutes. Ms. Abramson says, I know. Court says, we'll resume tomorrow. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll ask that you return tomorrow at 8:30 and we'll start up soon. Don't discuss the matter, blah, blah, blah. Okay. The jury exits the courtroom. The court says, we're still in session here. We're still in session. What I'm going to ask is tomorrow morning, the prosecution provide me with a list of the witnesses you expect to be testifying this week. And by Monday, both sides are ordered to present to the court a list of all witnesses you expect to testify in this trial in your case in chief. They haven't done this already? And if you know, in rebuttal, and also a time estimate for each witness that you expect to call. The approximate time estimate as to how long you expect the direct examination to be, and if you can, the cross examination. That will be on Monday. Tomorrow, the list, as I've indicated, will be in recess until tomorrow. So we will end here and we will pick up with the next day. So we've just completed day one. So in the next episode, we will do um, Lyle's opening statement, and then I might just go straight into the lead detective's testimony because it the prosecution, or sorry, the defense, Lyle, the defense's opening statement for Lyle is going to be a lot shorter, so I might just go straight into our first witness, which will be Leslie Zoller. So, thank you guys so much for watching with me, and I will see you guys in the next one. Please hit the like button on your way out. Take care. Bye now.